style railing that we put together for a client of ours. They provided us with these drawings, and this stair is a little bit different in that it also incorporates some cabling in with the standard wood components that we would normally just use. Here we're cutting the bottom of a post that's going to go at the bottom of the stair. Of course, none of the framing is perfectly plumb or level, so we have to make adjustments for that so that our railings all come out true and plumb. The skill saw is not big enough for this post to cut all the way through in one pass, so we cut on both sides and then use a chisel to clean up the center of the rest of the material that's hanging on. Here we locate the post at the bottom of the stair, check for plumb, and once we're satisfied with that, we'll go ahead and pre-drill for where the screws will be. Again, the post is large, and so the drill bit's not quite long enough to go all the way through, so we'll mark it with the drill, pull the post away, and then continue with our pilot holes here. We'll go ahead then and temporarily fasten this post with screws. And I say temporarily because the way they designed this railing, they don't want any of the cable ends to be seen when we're done. So we hide that in the post. And so you'll see how we do that as we go along. Here I've got an end cap that has all the cables coming through it, and that will get fastened at the top of the stair permanently. We won't have to take that back off again, but again, I had to pre-cut all the cables to length, a little long, so that we can make fine adjustments later. And the mid-span newels that were put in this aren't really structural based off of the way the rest of the railing is designed. So I toe those into place and then use trim head screws to fasten them permanently. Now I went ahead and pre-drilled all of these with the angle that we need for the holes going through for the railing. That was done earlier on before I got to this point, and I'll show you that in another video. Here I'm just laying out all the components, marking those and setting them up. I use a spacer block at the bottom to lift the bottom rail up off of the curb of the stair to the proper height, fasten those in place, tacking them with the brad gun, and then going ahead and using trim head screws to fasten those to all of the rest of the vertical components. Once I'm done with that, then we start working on the cross members that go in here. And this is kind of a detailed process because, one, the material being from reclaimed, though they milled it, still has moved a little bit. So nothing is perfectly square with this or straight. So that was kind of a process trying to figure out the best way to cut that so that our joints were nice and tight. But after some trial and error, we figured out this method here. And this is actually the last section of this railing on the staircase that I've done. So I figured out all of the problems we had with the previous sections of the stair, and this one actually went pretty fast. Of course, like anything, the first time you do something, it seems to take forever. Then you figure out a little trick, and then another trick, another trick. By the time you're done, you're wondering what took you so long in the first portions that you did. But here we've gone through and we figured out our angles, setting them in place. And since we want these to sit right into the corner, I have to figure out each cut one, set in place, and then cut the other angle so it drops into place. And once we have that done, we do that with the other section of the crossbuck. And then I just use a section of wood that I had left over to kind of mark those angles from one post to the other. Of course, pull those all back off and go back and trim that. So this, while it seems kind of tedious, it actually went pretty fast. So now having that all done, take the other portion of the crossbuck that I had pre-cut previously, and here I'm running through at rapid speed, marking where they cross. Once I have all those marked and making sure I'm going to be cutting on the right side, I take those over to the saw and I use the stop gauge on my Makita saw to set the depth. Then I also set the angle. And of course, there's two angles with this. There's one for one of the rails of the crossbuck and then one for the other rail of the crossbuck. So you make sure you're cutting those one the same angle with one, and then switch it for the next one on the other. And then I found that by using a zero clearance block at the back, I could not only locate where the cut should be without too much trial and error, but also it prevents any tear out in the back. It leaves for a nice clean cut. So here I'm cutting the short section of the crossbuck. And I did that for all three. And then I was able to do that for the long section as well, and then cut all three of those. So quickly put those together, made sure they fit, and then took it back out to the stair. Now, of course, though you lay things out as accurately as you can with each one, it doesn't mean that each section is exactly the same. So I went ahead and numbered each section. And what I'm doing here is making sure I have them in the right position, that they're both oriented towards the top so that we don't have any problems there, and then had them put in the correct bay, if you will, 1, 2, and 3. So I just pre-did that, and here I just, again, I'm double checking my tops to make sure that they're flush with everything. And where I was proud, after I screwed everything in, I took a block plane and just cleaned up the edges a little bit so that when that top rail went on, it would fit perfectly. Here I'm just marking out where the cables come through. Marking those onto the crossbuck members from the top to the bottom. And anytime you're doing this, you always have plenty of people interested in what you're doing, and a little bit of conversation makes the job go by faster anyway. So after I got those all marked out, I made a little jig with the proper angle on it, cut a little 90-degree notch out of there, and that allowed me to locate each of those holes where they went and make nice, accurate drilling through the crossbuck members. I did the same thing on those posts earlier, as I mentioned. It's a real nice, neat way to do that. It's pretty fast, and you can cut basically one of those angle blocks for each angle you have on the railing components. And so it just makes for a nice precision way without too much hassle. Here I just used a clamp and a couple of blocks to make sure that all of my crossbucks were perfectly lined up on the sides. And I used again, a trim head screw to hold that in place, making sure that it doesn't happen to go through where I'm also have drilled a hole for a cable in. That would be a problem. Again, using trim head screws, holding the crossbucks in place in each of their bays. Given that this was all reclaimed material, it was pretty wormy, and I actually used a wire brush to clean up and sort of distress it so that it had a nice old look to it, even though they went through and milled it. And then it was full of plenty of wormholes, and the trim head screws actually looked like a wormhole when we were done, so we didn't have to do any filling or plugging of those trim head screws. Here I'm pulling all of the cables through, making sure they all get down to the end. When I get down to the bottom there, I'll remove that post. then feed all those cables all the way through to the end of that end cap. We'll mark them for length. And there are a variety of cable systems out there. The cable system I used, I had to mark where the end piece was, then add 3/4 of an inch, and they would slide, the end of the cables would slide into a little ferrule. And we'll swage those on. You'll see me doing that here in a moment. With this device here, it's kind of a clamp. You do it 90 degrees one way and then 90 degrees the other, and that makes sure that those cables are in there nice and tight. When I'm done doing all of those, I'll feed them back through that end cap and put some screws or bolts on there and tighten those up. These are a little tricky because you don't realize until you start doing this just how much tension that puts on the wood. So that end member there, even though it's almost 2 inches thick, flexed quite a bit while I was doing this. So while this is what the architect and designer wanted, I don't recommend doing this because this was kind of a pain in the rear end. And you'll see me check here for, not checking for plumb, I'm checking to see how much I've actually pulled that thing out of line. So it's no longer straight, it's actually got a bow to it. And after having done the other sections, I kind of figured out just how much bow I could have in it and then be able to screw that back onto this post and have it tighten the railing up without loosening other sections of it loosening up. It was kind of tricky. Here all I've done is put that post on there and I marked where those cables come through. Then I put some relief holes in it so that it could be fastened back on there. Now that post is fastened on permanently. I don't have to worry about that again. And here I'm just fastening the top cap rail onto the unit. And again, I used trim hole screws where I could. And the railing had a bit of a bow to it, so I used 3/8 inch holes and then used deck screws to screw it down from the top so that I could pull the bow of that railing out. As I mentioned before, this reclaimed material was not exactly straight. So here we've come to the end of this section, screwing those in there, back in my work, and here's the rest of the railing system. I hope you enjoyed it. Please feel free to comment and subscribe to see more. Thanks.